I'm very, very happy to be here, not just because this is a topic that is very dear to my heart, but also because I'm in the midst of some very energetic scholars who will be the future of this field. So I thank the organizers for bringing this wonderful group of people together, and I look forward to hearing your most updated fieldwork. I left the field in Zambia several years ago already, so I've been keeping up with developments from afar. But having done so much fieldwork, I appreciate the discovery that you bring to the table, and I look forward very much to very interesting discussions. I don't know how many of you have just arrived, or how many of you have spent some time in Hong Kong. How many of you have spent the past week in Hong Kong?
I've been here most of my life.
Great. Well, the majority of people in the room apparently are visitors. But if you've spent the past weeks in Hong Kong, as I did, and many of my colleagues did, in the wake of all the events and incidents and emotions, I think talking about China is not the most desirable topic to be discussed at the moment. But we scholars are in the business of inconvenient truth, and also I'd like to convince you at the end of my talk that Hong Kong is part of global China. And global China lends a very important perspective to what is happening in Hong Kong. So what I'd like to do today is not to talk about my book. I've been talking about my book so many times that I'm sick and tired of it myself. So I promise you, it's not going to be about China in Zambia. I'm going to broaden the discussion to sort of frame our next 2 days of presentations, hopefully, and raise some fundamental issues. So the topic is really global China. What is it? What is global China? And I'm going to talk about not big concepts, grand concepts that have been in circulation in both the academia and the public debates internationally, concepts such as colonialism, hegemony, empire building, but to disaggregate global China according to the 3 questions I lay down here, which is why global China, how, what are the mechanisms for China to go abroad, to become global, and so what, the consequences. What do they add up? What do these activities add up? And hopefully, answering these questions or giving some overview of these aspects of global China will help us to rethink what are the concepts that may be most useful to think about this phenomenon, this development, rather than jumping to the conclusion that China is a new colonial power without examining what is happening on the ground, without examining how China is pursuing its global ambition, and the actual consequences, not in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of grounded discovery. So bear with me if I'm addressing something that you already know, but I think we need to ask basic questions, questions that may not be very glamorous or very ambitious and theoretical. The theory could come at the end. The theory should come and work with data, and that's my approach today. To sort of, and all of you have been working on different aspects of global China, so these are the images that you may be familiar with, but let's start, on the same pages. These days, when we talk about global China, most people, as Albert, my former colleague, has mentioned, most people are very interested and curious about China's activities and achievements in the Belt and Road Initiative. So this map, I'm sure you have seen, is one illustration of global China. On the ground, you see something more, which is ports with soldiers and some real names, companies, state-owned companies who are dominating the world sea trade. This is in Pakistan. Another picture in Pakistan. China is building roads in places that is almost unreachable. Look at the terrain. When I looked at this picture, it stunned me, just the visual. And there's a road, very nice modern road going through it, and China is doing it. From the sky, this is in Central Asia, connecting Urumqi in Xinjiang with Central Asian countries. Again, out of nowhere. And I think only China would be interested in building this kind of super modern, futuristic almost kind of infrastructure. We don't visit these places, but this is a dry port or the border between Kazakhstan and China is waiting for economic growth to happen. Not just in Central Asia, but in Italy. This is a very important port that China has attained majority ownership control. And there are several more ports in Italy. So China is making headway into Europe, not just in Central Asia. In Sri Lanka, now this port is almost brand new. It didn't exist before China appeared because it was built on artificial island. It is an artificial island built de novo by China. And China is now the leading country in terms of dredging technology and the industry capacity itself. This port has been very controversial, and one of our colleagues has been studying and reporting on it. A very interesting report, Sri Lanka Hambantota Tota. Is now under 99-year lease because of a loan issue. This is another new port built with Chinese concessional loans, Abu Dhabi. And this is a question for you. Where is this? Is another artificial island. This is in Hong Kong. And my insertion of this picture into a series of global China pictures sort of foretell what my argument of this talk will be. And there are many, many more reasons for China to build this island and the bridge. But if you put it in the context of global Chinese projects, it isn't that surprising. Hong Kong is just part of this global vision. And why build this kind of artificial islands in Hong Kong and around the world has a lot to do with domestic Chinese development, which I'll explain in a minute. This is Greece, again, a very historic port, and China has attained majority control. This is a very celebrated railway connecting Djibouti. The French Consul General mentioned China has a military base, the first overseas Chinese military base, but I must add that most advanced industrialized countries has a military base in Djibouti. And it was at the invitation of the Djibouti government that these guys are there to use their territory as military bases because the country has no other economic resources or point for growth. And so we have to interpret Chinese presence in that light. But this is a very celebrated railway, very much welcomed by Africans. One more picture, this is the industrial park between China and Belarus in Eastern Europe. So that the whole series of pictures shows the kind of infrastructural investment projects that we come to associate mostly. Most of the associations about global China have to do with these kinds of economic projects. But I'm going to indicate that there are other strategies of power that China has pursued very rigorously, but has been less studied. And I hope more people would pay attention to the two other mechanisms of power. This is a picture of overseas Chinese welcoming Xi Jinping's visit to London. This is another display of diasporic power in Sydney. And you can go to Google and find all sorts of their presence, especially when top leaders from China are visiting different parts of the world. And I think we need to really take a good look at how China is using network power, not just economic investment and loans, but also a vast network of overseas Chinese and United Front institutions now being globalized to match the global expansion and ambition of China. How do they work? How do these people, institution network, capital work to serve global Chinese ambition? The third mechanism of power that I will discuss has to do with symbols, culture, media, discourse, and CGTN, I still think of the old name, CCTV. CGTN is now the new version of what used to be CCTV, the global network. Now it's been revamped very much with heavily invested with different, I'll talk about this in a minute, but this is another image of global China that we should direct our research and scholarly attention to. Part of the third element, third strategy of Chinese power overseas, global China, about culture, that has drawn a lot of attention, is the work of Confucius Institutes, and not just at the university level, but also at more local Confucius classrooms. These are the platforms for China to use symbols, culture, discourse, emotions, people-to-people diplomacy to advance its presence. So again, if you break down global China into not just regions of influence like China in Africa, China in Latin America, but in a more theoretically engaging and interesting ways, using more generic, and theoretical concepts that have rich reservoirs of studies that we can draw on to understand global China. We should think in terms of power processes, not in terms of geographical locations of China's influence. Power processes, mechanisms of power, and to see and to examine how these play out, because these are generic power processes. And China is using them, maybe in unique ways, and they have been responded to in different parts of the world in very different and uneven ways. And so global China becomes a subject, not in and of itself, but totally integrated with historical, social-scientific studies, even cultural analysis, if you think about culture as one means of one modality of global Chinese expansion. So that's the overall kind of direction I want to go with this talk, which I don't know how much time I should. I hope to go very quickly so that we have more time for discussion. I think this is the spirit of this conference, which I see as more workshop, and I enjoy workshops more usually than conferences because things are in flux and we can shape each other's way of thinking. And this is very much an exploratory talk. I only have studied Chinese investment in one particular part of Africa, so there are many parts of my talk that I draw on from other people's studies, so it's by no means a kind of conclusive talk, it's more an exploration with you. So let me go to the three parts of my talk, which is really a kind of proposal for research. I will talk about why China is doing all these, how, the three mechanisms, and the consequences of the three arenas, three modalities of power that we've seen China working on. And I'll come back to Hong Kong if I have time, because my mind has been thinking about Hong Kong for the past month. and so if we have time, I'd like to bring where we are into this framework of global China. So why global China? I think we need to understand why China is doing all this in terms of two concepts, accumulation and legitimation. Now, crisis is a Marxist term, which we can bracket for a moment, but definitely challenges that has to do with accumulation and legitimation within China. So it's totally connected with what is happening in China, what China is doing globally. One thing that has been mentioned a lot, and I don't think there's any dispute about that, because if you can see these two quotes I highlighted here, even Chinese officials themselves admitted and recognized that going out or One Belt, One Road, or whatever label, the brand name they give it, this going out strategy has definitely very much to do with the need to export over capacity. The graph shows you the major industries that we're seeing that the Chinese are very concerned about, and the utilization rate compared to its production. Going down utilization means there's overcapacity, it's underutilized. I'm not going to go into the details, but the quotes suggest that to the Chinese government, this is a major imperative, is to resolve the crisis of overproduction, overcapacity, which has existed, if you look back in the history, and Albert could correct me if I'm wrong, that is, it's dated back to the late 1990s. The first time when Chinese officials mentioned overcapacity, it was way before or around the time of going out, which was the early 2000s and late 1990s. I maybe have to go very quickly about the systemic causes of overcapacity, but if you read Hong Hofeng's work, he emphasized a lot that the Chinese communist way of economic development relies on local accumulation. That kind of decentralized accumulation strategies has led to anarchic competition among localities, so everybody, many provinces, are producing many of the same things, even when these things are underutilized, because they have to register growth rate in their own jurisdiction. And so what you ended up having as a country is overaccumulation created by local competition, which has turned into an anarchic situation. The 2008 financial crisis globally has dealt a very hard blow to the Chinese export growth model, and as a result, we all know that China came out with a stimulus package that rivaled the amount in the U.S. stimulus. And what it has done, the result was it fueled another round of overinvestment in infrastructure. It's debt-fueled. We are not seeing the result yet because it was postponed. Its debt is buying the future to solve current problems. But that round of stimulus has led to another round of overcapacity in infrastructure. And so that's about the systemic problem of overcapacity. What other economic reasons for global China expansion has to do with the need for Chinese economy to climb the value chain, because export-led growth using mass-produced low-end goods has exhausted its potential. The export markets has dried, as is reviewed in post-2008 economy. And so there is a need for China to climb the global chain. I talked to some officials in China, and even low-level government officials, not dealing with economic growth. I look at Weiwen, which is how they deal with protests. But even those officials are very aware that in Guangdong, for instance, the whole economy has to pursue this global value chain. So one way to do it is to acquire existing technology, high-tech companies, which they have done very well in Germany. We've seen a German report published in Made in China that Ivan was responsible for, that the German unions have a very comprehensive documentation of the Chinese acquisition of high-tech companies, the very extreme high-tech. We're talking about robotic industry, the kind of very important national champions in Germany. So this is another economic reason. There are other economic sectors receiving very heavy state investment in, as I mentioned, dredging and shipping, because they serve the purpose of nation building. These are creating new territories, creating artificial islands, basically expand China's territorial power de novo, because they don't need to compete with existing old power, which have influence over existing territories. What best way to create new power, territorial power, but to create new territory? So these are the systemic reasons, which is tied to another reason, the why. I'm still answering the question of why global China, tied to this idea of legitimation and governance challenges. Because in China, as you all know, economic is also political. especially for Chinese Communist legitimacy, what some people have called performance legitimacy. When the economy grows, high growth rates will bring legitimacy to the party. But what happens when growth slows? You will have a crisis, or at least in the perception of the elite, there is a challenge to its one-party legitimacy. And so global China will help resolve or take away some of the burden of the legitimacy challenges, because by expanding outwards, you can export a lot of the problems. Unemployment, underemployment. In Africa, I met a lot of university grad students trying to find jobs that they cannot find in China. Now they have a whole new labor market for them to go, and engineers. And so they're exporting some of the domestic problems abroad. And also pursuing global status would boost nationalism, which is the go-to kind of strategy for China to resolve governance issue. That has been a strategy for a long time. And I think pursuing global status and influence is complementary to the economic strategy, and it helps to build this idea of Chinese nationalism as a reaction to 100 years of humiliation. Now we can stand among nations. We are equally influential abroad to establish domestic nationalist legitimacy. And so you have the Chinese dream of China's great national rejuvenation. Another very important governance issue that could be alleviated or resolved by pursuing global China strategy is ethnic and religious strife in the peripheral regions of China. And there's no accident that BRI has been most active along the borders of the Chinese jurisdiction, because along the borders, because by building, investing, extending loans to neighboring countries through the BRI initiative, these are places which have lots of ties with the rest of ethnic regions along China's borderland as well. So it's one way to resolve tensions along the border, resolve the ethnic issues by economic means. And this has been the strategy for China in dealing with minority regions, now taking a more global dimension. So of course, governance issue, legitimation issue, the global expansion issue has to do with Xi Jinping's own and personal ambition maybe. But this is of course speculation, so I should skip. Let me come to the second part and the second question, and I have to go faster here, looking at the time, is about how. And I think these are very self-explanatory. I think I can identify three mechanisms of power, or three mechanisms of achieving global China. The first one is economic statecraft. The second is patron clientelism. The third is the use of symbols and emotions. And what I want to argue is that all these three have domestic parallels. All these three are very conventional mechanisms of dominations, ways of powers that we found even before the communists took power, that they have been using to win over the nationalists, even during the revolutionary period. Not so much with economic statecraft, but with the other two. Now, you can see both within and abroad, state capital in the form of SOEs, loans, and fixed asset investment. These are the strategies that China have exported from their use within China for the past, 30 years since the reform, and now using the same mechanisms abroad. SOEs, we are familiar with SOEs even before the reform. SOEs have objectives beyond profit, and Kelly herself and Barry Norton have theorized this notion of state capitalism. And so nowadays, we see one of the major actors of global China is SOEs. state capital. And what we see is that, yes, at home it has more than economic objectives and missions, creating employment, stabilizing society, controlling society through work unit. These are these textbook topics that we cover in our undergrad China classes. Abroad today, again, SOEs, state capitals, have objectives beyond accumulation, beyond profit, and so it's the same tools. Of course, there's the range of objectives may be broader, but they are political, practical. But the point is, it's not just economic. It's the state using economic units to achieve state power, however it wants to define, including economic domination. People complain all the time about loans and fixed asset investment creating debt trap. Well, not is this means of power, the tool of power that has been used by IMF and the World Bank for a long, long time before China uses it. But China uses it inside China also. So when we think about global China, it's wrong to just segregate global China from the rest of China and from the rest of the world in terms of development instruments. So I don't want to, before BRI, before Global China, there's developed the West. Again, we see a lot of state-owned enterprises going to the West using loans and debt and subsidies from Beijing. And where do they invest? They also invest in fixed asset investment, in infrastructure. So it is the same playbook that we're seeing. And the same playbook is even clearer when we look at patron clientelism. I remember the first book that really drew me and made me determined to become a China scholar was Andrew Walder's Neo-Traditionalism. And he was talking about the work units and the kind of authority and power relationship in the work unit. Communist power was all about, well, not all, but mainly about patron clientelism. And we are seeing all this being played over again within China, as I study how the Chinese state stabilized society, maintained stability, talking to the protesters. But in global China also, United Front has gone global. As I mentioned earlier, this United Front strategy originated in the 20s. At first, it was used it was targeting influential non-communist intellectuals to win them to be supporters or sympathizers or neutral participants in the communist project. Intellectuals, writers, teachers, publishers, business people. And since the 1940s, they start targeting overseas Chinese. What we've seen today is that this pool of clients have expanded. The overseas Chinese diaspora in 180 countries, and Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau are the targets today. And if you look at the pictures I show you, which I won't have time to go into, but look at the Clans Association, the Hometowns Associations in Hong Kong, there are many, and overseas in all major cities. These are now being targeted, given a lot of resources, a lot of material exchanges between the leaders of the overseas Chinese associations, giving them all sorts of business opportunities back to China. Through them, Chinese government can influence local community, local opinion leaders, and sometimes in some countries, local politicians and politics. The mechanism, the tactics, the practices may be different, but if you look into the mechanism, which is what we should pay attention to, is material exchange for political support. And that is, to me, a very classic case of patron clientelism. To co-opt and to influence by exchanging favors. So this is, I don't intend you to be able to read it, but this is a United Front machinery and how it is connected to all parts of different departments of the Communist Party organization. So it is a machine that has lots of branches, lots of ways of works, and with direct, indirect influences that is now being kicked off and being revamped, re-energized, repurposed, reinvested to do the work to complement global China projects. The third element in China's playbook that we have seen used within China but now is being exported is the use of symbols, emotions, discourse, nationalism. We know Chinese Communist revolutions, the popular support for that revolution has a lot to do with its successful mobilization of nationalism during a period when Japan was invading and the countryside, the peasantry, were in the grips of Japanese imperialism. And the Communist Party in China have very successfully mobilized this idea of nationalism, the nation, motherland, since the 30s. And then lots of studies after the revolution also indicate that emotion is being used by what looks like a very totalitarian and cold-hearted regime. But emotion, mobilizing mass feelings, has never been very far away from the way of power. If you look at all the ethnographic historiographies of the land reform, the ritual of speaking bitterness, the emotions that have been mobilized to stage struggle sessions, class feelings. This is a term that is very unique to Chinese Marxists. People, you don't find any references of feelings of class except in the practice of communist power in terms of how you forge alliance with the peasants and the workers. You have to develop class feelings. Elizabeth Perry has written a lot about how emotion has been a very major tool in the Chinese communist repertoire of domination of power. Using national learning and tradition and culture, again, is part of the way of Chinese communist power. And people point to Confucius Institute. Of course, that was a very important element, but that network of CIs emerged in 2004. But before that, inside China, Confucius or national learning has become very popular, has been pushed by official institutions in universities within China itself. And it has been exported, this idea of Confucius learning and institute has been exported. But it grew from an experiment, grew from domestic policy, using tradition to enforce current power, the use of symbols, use of emotions. Changing the discourse, again, when I talk to officials in China for domestic Chinese projects that I was working on, the officials I talk about 话语权, discursive power, when they want to maintain stability inside China. Now we hear the same idea of discursive power being used and pursued when China expands outward. And these are quotes from top leaders when they talk about seizing the discourse, regain the right to speak. And of course, they have specific targets to counter the narrative of China threat, the narrative of Chinese new colonialism, China's collapse. To react to that, China is creating a new discourse, new keywords. The China model, peaceful rise, China dream, these are the way very illustrative, prominent examples of China mobilizing, trying to use narratives to counter bad narratives. And Xi Jinping has made the demand that everybody should try to tell a good China story to counter all these other negative stories about the Chinese by the West. Anyway, and we can point to how the state media, I'm not going into the details, I will leave the slides, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the actual acquisition of global media outlets in many, many different forms, by the way, not always in form of majority stake or direct ownership. They would provide, one very clever way, especially in poor countries, is for China to provide a newspaper insert for free so that newspapers could include, and this is a global circulation, in the millions. In different major national newspapers, the Chinese would publish daily or weekly inserts called China Watch. In Zambia, I saw it myself, the most popular newspaper comes with an insert that is free. And if you're a poor media company, you welcome that kind of added material at no cost to you. And there is another strand of the use of emotions, and that is the people-to-people diplomacy. Many very distinguished Western intellectuals, academics, have been invited and treated like royalties, invited to China, all costs paid kind of trips, to cultivate good feelings and emotions. When they go home, they would then tell good China stories. And then, of course, that doesn't limit, the strategy isn't limited to the top elite. We have youth-to-youth groups, volunteers, people-to-people diplomacy. NGOs have gone global as well. So global China, we should pay attention to how Chinese NGOs have gone global and what they're doing, to what consequences. Anyway, so many of these. Let me try to wrap up very quickly, come to the third question. So what? This is the part that people have jumped to without looking at the empirical fact, and they come to the conclusion using grand or grandiose concepts that I don't think have much empirical foundation. People would jump to answer the question, so what? They would say colonialism. They would say imperialism. They would say hegemony. But we need to assess the so what. China has done all these. China have all these ambitions. They have mobilized these conventional power toolkits abroad. But the real question that very few people have answered, because it's not easy to answer, as Albert said, it takes a lot of work and hard work to really answer the real question of, so what's the consequence? Is China succeeding? All these terms have conflated China's ambition with China's achievement. If China has colonial ambition, if China has hegemonic ambition, has it succeeded? Don't conflate these terms. People say, oh, China is colonial. If I'm going to give in to that argument, the most I could give in is that maybe in terms of ambition, but that doesn't say anything about what is achieved on the ground. Let me quickly say, and my question, and not just my own answer based on my own research, but based on other people's research, is that on all three mechanisms of power, the Chinese are not succeeding. There are a lot of examples, well-documented empirical studies that China, if anything, to oversimplify a complex and uneven story, it is failing. My own book, I don't want to repeat, I found that in copper, a very important sector in the extractive industry, China is making a lot of compromises, sometimes to the detriment of its economic objectives of making profit. At least it's not making profit now. And if you look around the world at the Belt and Road projects and all the railroad projects, a port project it has built, China is encountering a lot of political risks, financial risks, social risks. And nothing is better to sum up all these risks and the large amount of failure is this Financial Times report, which is an investigative, I can give you the citation for people who are interested. It is a calculation of all the values of abandoned Chinese rail projects in different parts of the world compared to rail projects funded by Chinese loans and aids, compared to Chinese railroad projects that are ongoing. That is, failed projects compared to ongoing projects. The former, that is, projects that have been abandoned because they can't go on for all sorts of reasons, because of protests, because the country is too poor, because of technical issues, is doubled those that are still ongoing. And this is not me saying it, it's Financial Times sending reporters to different parts of the world. And this is another EU-funded report saying that the scale of funding of the BRI is too small to overcome the overcapacity problem that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So the EU is not optimistic that if overcapacity is the problem through which BRI is supposed to solve, then the potential, the outlook is not good. What about the use of social capital and patronage? Well, it has encountered, again, lots of problems, not the least because Western powers are very, very conscious and alert to it. Last month, I was in a conference where some major figures, including Larry Diamond and Orville Schell, and behind them a huge arsenal of scholars debunking or exposing what sharp power has been working in different parts of the world, including Australia, New Zealand, France, Europe, Canada, many countries. And they come up with a very, very critical idea that Chinese sharp power, which we call patron clientelism in a more benign way, they call sharp power and saying that it is corrosive, it is corrupt, it is penetrative, and by the way, because of this articulation, many countries, most prominently in Australia and New Zealand, the governments have reacted with legislation stopping foreign political infiltration, which they have detected the use of Chinese patron clientelism. And of course, we see that the CI, I have to jump to CI, is not succeeding. Many universities, especially those that are more resourceful or more conscious about their reputation, they are now rejecting the Confucius Institute. And one particular new study is an ethnographic study of CIs and CI classrooms, have come out with the students' reaction. The students are rejecting these classes. They went to these classes and went to these tours, but they were rejecting this kind of history, they call it History Channel version of Chinese culture. It's a very sanitized version of official museum pieces of Chinese culture. They're not buying it. So soft power or use of symbol is not really working. So I don't want to go to Hong Kong. If we want to, we can use Q&A time. But I have to stop by concluding that the so what, based on other people's research on all three fronts, do not warrant the labels that we are so familiar with in the public domain to talk about global China, i.e. colonialism, imperialism, hegemony. In Hong Kong, nobody believes that with all the power that China has at its disposal, there's no hegemony. If hegemony means moral leadership and the common sense compliance to power. As what we saw in the past 2 weeks is a refutation of hegemonic power, very powerful rejection. So if global China can't really dominate Hong Kong, where it has sovereignty recognized by the international community, we can imagine the kind of resistance and problems and challenges global Chinese playbook has and is encountering in the rest of the world. Thank you.